You're listening to The Corridor, presented by Threshold. To learn more and support our work, go to thresholdpodcast.org.
I'm not sure that plants have been locating along the Mississippi River corridor with a racial motivation, but that doesn't mean that there's not a disproportionate impact being felt by the minority community.
This is Kai Midbo, head of Louisiana's Department of Environmental Quality, in a TV interview from 1993.
Minorities in Louisiana tend to be disproportionately represented in the poorer sectors of our economy. And what's happening is these companies are locating where they can buy land cheaply, next to the Mississippi River and so forth. So there tends to be a disproportionate impact, and we want to take a good, careful look at that.
Hearing a state official, and the head of the DEQ at that, even acknowledge that some communities might face more harm from pollution than others, that was a major step forward for environmental justice in Louisiana. And Midbo wasn't an environmentalist. He was an industry guy who had been an oil and gas lawyer before leading the DEQ. At the time, Midbo was in charge of a commission investigating whether race was a factor in pollution in the corridor. And if it was one, to come up with solutions. When he was asked whether he thought he'd find something, Midbo replied,
Well, I think there's a real basis for concern, and we're going to look into it.
The DEQ looked into it all right. They took a long, long look. When I started reporting in 2023, they were still looking into it. The federal government was taking its time, too. Here's what Dr. Clarice Gaylord, director of EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, said in 1993.
The agency is working on targeted enforcement efforts. The best strategy is to go after the communities that have the worst pollution. As an example, there's a targeted enforcement effort in Cancer Alley in Louisiana because that area of the country has the worst air quality in the country.
But a decade later, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights checked in on the EPA's progress on environmental justice and found it underwhelming. Despite President Clinton's environmental justice executive order and a lot of publicity, the agency had still never denied a permit or withheld federal funding because of environmental racism. In fact, they largely failed to even investigate most of the complaints they'd received. And so pollution is still a big problem for residents of the corridor. But Louisiana isn't the only place with a pollution problem. Nearly half of Americans breathe in unhealthy levels of air pollution every day. And we know that toxic waste and industrial pollution aren't distributed evenly. You're much more likely to breathe harmful air if you're Black. But what are you supposed to do with that knowledge? If you live next to a plant, how can you prove you're being unfairly harmed by pollution? And if you do prove it, who's going to fix it? In our last episode, we looked at the protests that drew new attention to environmental justice and put a national spotlight on the corridor. But as years passed and the government spun its wheels, people affected by pollution here decided to try their luck somewhere else. In court. I'm Jaha Naila Avery, and in this episode of The Corridor, we're going to follow one community's search for any law that might help them stop pollution and what they found.
Some of these communities really feel in the dark about what it is that they're breathing every day.
This is Dina Toomey, a senior attorney at the environmental law firm Earth Justice. Lawyers like Dina often get involved when the government hasn't fixed the problem. But fighting environmental racism in court isn't straightforward because the law has historically treated civil rights and the environment as completely separate issues.
Environmental laws on their own are not enough because they don't account for the concentration of environmental harm in low-income communities of color, and they don't guarantee that the law will be enforced evenly across these communities. So these communities, like the community in St. John, they need both environmental laws and civil rights laws to be enforced.
Dina's been working with residents in St. John the Baptist Parish, where air pollution is particularly severe.
St. John the Baptist Parish has faced the highest cancer risks from toxic air pollution in the nation for much of the last decade because the EPA and state agencies have failed to protect them.
More than 200 plants produce toxic chemicals in the corridor. But in this episode, we're going to follow the story of just one, Dinka Performance Elastomer in St. John. Dinka makes neoprene, the squishy waterproof material in things like wetsuits, yoga mats, and disposable gloves.
The first successful general-purpose synthetic rubber ever made.
That's a spokesperson for DuPont, the company that built this plant in 1969. A key ingredient in neoprene is a colorless liquid called chloroprene. It's made the same way a lot of chemicals are, with fossil fuels. Dinka got the ingredients to make chloroprene from other plants in the corridor, like Shell, which is just down the road. And like a lot of chemicals made here, it's really dangerous.
So in 2010, EPA concluded that a chemical called chloroprene is likely to be carcinogenic to humans, and that inhalation of chloroprene increased not only the risk of cancer, but also damage to several systems in the human body, like the nervous, cardiovascular, hematological, immune systems.
At the time, Louisiana was the only place in the U.S. where neoprene was made. Another plant in Kentucky shut down in 2008 after pressure from politicians and residents angry about pollution. After that, the people who lived by this plant in Louisiana were the only people in the country who breathe in chloroprene on a daily basis. And 90% of those people are Black. Among those closest to the neoprene plant were children. Fifth Ward Elementary School was less than half a mile away, and over 300 kids went there. Most of them were younger than 10, and nearly all were Black or brown.
Children are paying the highest price for this. Children are more vulnerable to cancer risk from chloroprene because chloroprene has a mutagenic mode of action, which means it mutates your DNA. And kids accumulate cancer risk more rapidly than adults do because their bodies are less able to repair the genetic damage.
Kids weren't the only ones at risk. For decades, lots of people worried that pollution from the plant was making them sick. For one, the plant stinks. Chloroprene has a sweet, pungent odor that's kind of like nail polish remover. That smell kept people indoors year-round. Some said they couldn't turn their air conditioners on even in the middle of a hot summer because it made the smell worse. But scientific proof, especially the kind that government officials would accept, was hard to come by.
And then in 2014, EPA concluded that St. John residents faced the highest cancer risk from toxic air pollution in the nation. And EPA at the time attributed about 85% of that cancer risk to chloroprene emissions from just one facility in the parish.
That one facility was Dinka. And that EPA report confirmed what residents had always suspected. Now, if you're a resident of St. John, and the government agency charged with protecting the environment pointed out that something bad was happening in your community, like an elevated risk of cancer from air pollution, you would assume that somebody would have to fix it, right?
These are rampant and deadly health risks that are preventable, but it requires political will to prevent them.
But that political will was sorely missing. Lots of people felt like the state wasn't giving them clear information, and when they did hear from state officials, it was often to downplay the situation.
There's no smoking gun. Believe me, if we felt that there was an imminent threat, we would be taking the appropriate measures to deal with that threat.
That's the head of the Department of Environmental Quality speaking at a community meeting in St. John in 2016. He assured residents that the state and the EPA were monitoring air quality closely and that they were working with Dinka to lower emissions. When the EPA inspected the plant, though, they found all kinds of places where chloroprene could be leaking into the air. In 2017, Dinka agreed to install expensive pollution control equipment, which did help a little. But chloroprene levels in St. John remain much higher than EPA's safe limit. In fact, the DEQ claimed that those EPA limits were simply suggestions.
That is not a standard. It's just a guidance. A guidance. That EPA first put out, that everybody has sort of attached themselves to. So all the numbers that folks have been putting out there and saying it is a standard, there is no standard. It's just guidance.
The plant manager at Dinka was even more blunt. He told CNN that, quote, there is no relationship between chloroprene and cancer. Behind the scenes, Dinka was lobbying EPA to recalculate the chemical's risk and raise acceptable emission standards. Louisiana State Health Officer, Dr. Jimmy Guidry, told people near Dinka that they should be more concerned about their own lifestyles than what was happening at the plant.
You have to live healthy as best you can, and you have to minimize exposures as best you can. There's risk in everything.
This is something that people here have been hearing from industry lobbyists and politicians for years. Many residents at the meeting weren't satisfied with these answers.
We live here. It's not like at the end of the meeting we pack up and we go to some other place. We live here, our kids are here, our families are here, so it is a serious concern.
But it didn't feel like anyone else was taking it seriously. Government investigations, public pressure, and voluntary agreements had not fixed the problem. This is where Dina and the Earth Justice lawyers came in.
Yeah, so concerned citizens of St. John and some other groups in Louisiana approached us asking for help, asking to see if we could help them with some serious environmental issues they were having in their communities.
Concerned Citizens of St. John formed right after people learned about the cancer risk from chloroprene. They lobbied state and local politicians, held community meetings, collected air monitoring data, and filed petitions. They also protested.
DuPont, you're in violation. DuPont, you're in violation. DuPont, you're in violation.
They weren't asking for the plant to close. They only wanted emissions below the safe limit. But they weren't getting anywhere. The EPA had shown how toxic the air was near Dinka. They documented major violations at the plant, and study after study showed the unfair burden of pollution on BIPOC communities. But as residents soon learned, while the government can use this data to levy fines or demand change, they don't have to do any of these things. And in St. John, they mostly didn't.
Enforcement has been a problem in the past. Part of the problem is that the rules are written in a way that can make them difficult to enforce. And another major issue is that sometimes EPA doesn't have the will to fully enforce these rules.
So people set out to make them do something. In court. But how? Well, you could sue them directly, claiming that Dinka's actions caused you personal harm. And that's the first thing people in St. John tried. They sued Dinka in their local court, asking a judge to make the plant keep emissions below the safe limit. But it's hard to prove that one single plant caused a health problem when there are so many factors involved, and their cases went nowhere. And people living near the plant felt like there was another reason their concerns had been ignored for so long, a reason that had to do with all the history here in the river parishes, and really across the whole country. A lot of them felt the situation would be a whole lot different if they were white. Here's Robert Taylor, the founder of Concerned Citizens of St. John, in 2019.
They have all the science. They know all the results of this. We've been considered expendable.
State officials insisted that their decisions about industry had nothing to do with race, and that the risk of cancer from pollution didn't either. But back in the 1990s, a federal commission had proven that race was a factor, and now EPA data was backing that up. But EPA isn't just supposed to prevent pollution. It's supposed to prevent discrimination too. All federal agencies are. But making that happen is more difficult than it may sound. That's because laws about discrimination and laws about pollution have two different origin stories. Making these two bodies of law work together is difficult, even when the government says it is trying. For people in St. John, it didn't really feel like the government had ever been trying. But by 2021, a new administration was in office, one that seemed to take environmental justice very seriously. Here's President Biden.
Environmental justice will be the mission of the entire government, woven directly into how we work with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. For example, there's a lot we still don't know about the quality of people's wastewater or the air they're breathing. There's still a lot we don't know about the cumulative impacts of pollution on people's health. We need to learn more so we can serve those communities better and help the world overall.
And Biden's new head of the EPA, Michael Regan, seemed committed to environmental justice too. He even visited the corridor.
When you visit a place like St. John's the Baptist Parish, you don't just simply look away. Before I ended that visit, I vowed that EPA would take action in response to the alarming conditions we saw while here on the ground. I pledged to prioritize the health and safety of this community and other communities like this that have been historically overburdened by pollution.
With new leaders saying all the right things, people in St. John and lawyers like Dina felt like the time was right for a new strategy. They didn't just want to prove that Dinka was polluting. They wanted to show that the whole way Louisiana issues permits to industry was discriminatory. To do that, they were going to try a different legal approach, one that tied air pollution to civil rights and tied the history of industry to the history of racism in the river parishes. After the break, the EPA comes to town.
Sometimes you just need a moment in nature. And the Points North podcast has you covered.
Okay, check 1, 2, all right. Rolling.
You can listen to top-notch stories that sink deeply into the natural world, with moments of surprise.
It's amazing. Oh my God. Oh my God.
I thought this was a pear. This is an absolutely crazy apple tree.
Moments of wonder.
When a plant opens its bloom, it's kind of like it's opening its eyes in a way, right?
It's like you're talking to a bird. Oh yeah, it gives me goosebumps every time.
And moments of calm, where you can just slow down. Get your nature fix. Listen to Points North. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Water temperature is pretty nice. All right, wish me luck. Here we go.
Hi, it's Jaha. If you're looking for another show that brings you fascinating stories about our relationship with the natural world, I'm excited to tell you about the award-winning podcast, Sea Change, produced by our friends at WWNO, New Orleans Public Radio. Living on the coast means living on the front lines of a rapidly warming planet. Sea Change tells captivating and deeply reported stories about how life on our coast is changing. This season, Sea Change travels to the Netherlands, where the Dutch are learning to live with water instead of fighting it, to fragile seabird colonies where saving puffins and pelicans has become a race against climate change, and to coastal Louisiana, where fishermen are being arrested in a battle over a place known as Sportsman's Paradise. Sea Change has over 2 million downloads and has been named a can't-miss podcast by NPR. So go ahead. Follow Sea Change on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and tell them Threshold sent you.
This is Climate Justice, y'all, a podcast dedicated to lifting up and centering the climate and environmental justice movement in the South.
We decided to pull up a chair and amplify the stories of the communities here in the South hit the hardest by the climate crisis.
We're using good old-fashioned storytelling to shine a spotlight on these Southern leaders from all walks of life, putting in their blood, sweat, and tears to transform the region.
The usage of y'all and the title is on purpose. We are honoring our Southern heritage of creativity, resilience, and ingenuity.
Climate justice, y'all.
It's real.
It's here.
And it's about time y'all hear what we have to say.
I'll never forget my first trip to St. John the Baptist Parish. I distinctly remember standing on the grounds of a school that was a stone's throw away from a facility that manufactures toxic chemicals.
Welcome back to The Corridor. I'm Jaha Naila Avery, And this is EPA Administrator Michael Reagan in 2023, speaking by the 5th Ward Elementary School in St. John the Baptist Parish.
The children who attend that school, who study at that school, who eat lunch at that school every single day, look just like my son Matthew. And nearly every person that I spoke with knew someone who suffered from an illness that they believed was connected to the pollution in the air they breathe. I was able to see firsthand the generational and widespread effects pollution can have on so many of our families.
Reagan was the first Black man to lead the EPA. He had grown up in North Carolina, less than 100 miles from Warren County, where the protest over a landfill launched the nationwide movement for environmental justice in the 1980s. It's something he talked about often, saying it inspired his career path. And in Louisiana, Reagan's vocal commitment to environmental justice gave residents of Cancer Alley hope that their concerns would finally be taken seriously.
Communities and advocates were really encouraged by what they were hearing EPA say it would do.
This is Dina Toomey again, an attorney with Earth Justice. For the first time since the 1990s, with a new president and new leadership at EPA, it seemed like environmental justice might actually be a government priority.
EPA promised to enforce Title VI. It promised to advance environmental justice. And so after they sort of made that announcement, communities started filing these complaints.
Among those taking action were the concerned citizens of St. John. The first thing they did was sue EPA under the Clean Air Act. They wanted to make the agency update air pollution standards for chloroprene. They also filed a petition asking EPA to use its emergency powers to stop Dinka from polluting immediately. But those were stopgap measures aimed at one specific plant. They didn't address what people felt was the bigger issue: discrimination in who was exposed to industrial pollution in the first place. For that, they needed to look at a whole different set of laws, civil rights laws. But that's also where things get more complicated, because over the years, the Supreme Court has blocked off many of the legal pathways that people could use to address racial disparities. The first place you might think to go for civil rights issues is the Constitution, specifically the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. That's the one that says that states have to treat everyone equally under the law.
The Equal Protection Clause of Amendment 14 prohibits a state from making arbitrary or unreasonable distinctions between different persons as to their rights and privileges.
The 14th Amendment is the one that civil rights lawyers used to desegregate schools in the 1950s and to overturn laws prohibiting interracial marriage in the 1960s. But although the 14th Amendment was used to make these landmark decisions, in 1976, the Supreme Court ruled that the impact of a policy doesn't matter if we don't know the intention behind it.
We hold that to prove an unconstitutional racial discrimination under the Equal Protection or Due Process Clauses, it is essential that a racially discriminatory purpose be shown in some manner.
You basically need somebody to actually say, on the record, I'm being racist, for it to count.
Intentional discrimination is very difficult to show.
So for people in St. John, the 14th Amendment was out. But there was another option.
So the way anti-discrimination law in the United States works is that we've traditionally divided it up into two camps. There's intentional discrimination and disparate impact.
Disparate impact is about outcomes. Because whether or not anybody intends for pollution to cause more harm to BIPOC people, it's still a fact that it does. Especially in the corridor, where the people affected by pollution are disproportionately Black.
Because oftentimes, these state actors are not acting with an intent to discriminate. They're just, the decisions they're making have a disparate impact on these populations.
And to address that impact, lawyers turned to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the massive piece of legislation that outlawed discrimination in schools, businesses, public spaces, voting, and employment. A key part of the act is something called Title VI. That's the law that EPA had promised to start using way back in the 1990s, after President Clinton's executive order on environmental justice.
Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits these state agencies and others from discriminating on the basis of race, color, or national origin.
Title VI says that state agencies can't get federal funds if they discriminate, intentionally or not.
It's possible to violate Title VI of the Civil Rights Act without necessarily having the intent to discriminate.
So evidence of unfair pollution in St. John would make a great Title VI lawsuit, right? You would think so. Except that in 2001, the Supreme Court ruled that individuals can't sue for disparate impact. The only way to get it enforced is to file a complaint with a federal agency like EPA, asking them to review whether someone they fund is discriminating against you. For a long time, though, these kind of complaints went nowhere.
EPA has a history of failing to implement Title VI.
In its 50-plus year history, EPA has almost never made a formal finding of discrimination. 9 out of every 10 complaints alleging environmental discrimination have been dismissed without investigation.
Title VI is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and EPA has been obligated since that time to enforce Title VI. But for decades, EPA didn't enforce it at all.
Even in the Clinton era, where the EPA loudly stated its commitment to environmental justice, not one of the nearly 60 Title VI claims filed went anywhere. But people kept filing complaints because it was one of the only legal pathways left for communities unfairly impacted by pollution. And so complaints just piled up for decades, until 2022.
So in January 2022, concerned citizens of St. John and Sierra Club filed a civil rights complaint with the EPA, and they alleged that the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality and the Louisiana Department of Health violated their civil rights by failing to protect the predominantly Black community in St. John from disproportionate toxic air pollution.
Their complaint said that these state agencies had engaged in racial discrimination by allowing so many polluting industries to operate in majority Black communities. And surprisingly, this complaint actually got somewhere. Just days after the complaint was filed, EPA Administrator Michael Reagan sent a letter to the CEO of DENCA warning that the EPA and the Department of Justice were going to, quote, redouble their efforts to seek timely and concrete relief for this community. And that spring, the EPA came to inspect DENCA again.
So in 2022, EPA inspected the neoprene production facility in St. John and discovered that the facility was illegally dumping hazardous waste in an open brine pit. They measured alarming amounts of chloroprene in the air, and it was so unsafe to breathe there, actually, that EPA inspectors had to leave the premises and couldn't finish the inspection that day.
The EPA also sent a new pollution accountability team to collect data across Cancer Alley, equipped with all sorts of gear. Handheld ultraviolet gas detectors, infrared cameras, even a van with a built-in weather station. Sort of like Ghostbusters, but for invisible air toxins. They even had a special airplane. After all this investigating, the EPA found what people in St. John already knew. The people living closest to the plant were exposed to chloroprene levels much higher than the safe limit, and this exposure increased their lifetime risk of cancer. The risk was even worse for kids. According to air monitoring data, babies born near the plants would pick up more than a lifetime's worth of cancer risk in just their first 2 years. The EPA didn't just find pollution violations. They also found problems with the way DEQ and the Department of Health operated. They found that the state hadn't provided accurate information to those most affected, that the state had no process for even considering environmental justice, and that there didn't seem to be a way for citizens to ask questions or make complaints, something that the EPA requires of agencies that get their money, and frankly, what every government is supposed to do. Not only that, even the air permits that Louisiana had given to DENCA were expired and had been for years. All of this appeared to vindicate the Title VI complaint that Dina helped the residents to file. So what was the EPA going to do about it?
EPA is required by law to try to resolve these complaints by reaching an informal resolution agreement with the parties that allegedly, violated Title VI. They're called informal resolution agreements. And these agreements can require them to take measures to ensure compliance with Title VI.
Compliance, meaning stop discriminating. The EPA was taking Title VI more seriously than it ever had. It was proactively making environmental justice a criteria for getting federal money. The EPA also took action on the complaints residents had raised earlier. First, it forced Dinka to change how it disposed of its hazardous waste. Then it sued the plant directly, asking a court to make the plant lower its emissions immediately. Even Louisiana started to do something. The state conducted its first public health study on chloroprene, taking urine samples from residents and confirming that the chemical posed an increased risk of cancer. By the time EPA leader Michael Reagan returned to St. John to give a speech in the spring of 2023, it seemed like environmental and civil rights lawsuits were converging to force real action in Louisiana and in the EPA. And on that visit, Reagan announced a sweeping new policy.
Folks, our work isn't done. And that's why I'm proud to announce today that EPA is building on our commitment and proposing a regulation slashing the emissions of highly toxic chemicals like chloroprene and ethylene oxide, also known as ETO. When finalized, this regulation will drastically reduce the risk of cancer caused by exposure to ETO and chloroprene, especially in states like Louisiana and Texas, where the vast majority of these facilities are located.
A new set of rules to limit emissions from chemical and plastics plants. Just what residents in St. John had asked for in 2021. Meanwhile, an agreement between EPA and the state to resolve the Title VI complaint was inching towards approval. And because residents of another parish, St. James, had also filed a Title VI complaint, the draft agreement would resolve that one too. In fact, the agreement would overhaul the entire way Louisiana issues air quality permits.
The agreement would have required Louisiana to change the way it conducts air permitting, not just in St. John, but across the state. It would have required the agency to consider the disparate impact of air permitting decisions on the basis of race, color, or national origin.
Not only would the state have to consider the disproportionate impact of individual permits, but for the first time, it would have to consider how much pollution a community is already exposed to and how a new plant would add to that risk.
And in a state like Louisiana, with a rampant and deadly history of environmental injustice, this kind of change could have made an enormous difference for the communities who really need it most. It could have potentially saved lives.
For people in the corridor, the Title VI agreement would be a game changer.
But just a matter of weeks before the agreement was supposed to become final,
at the last minute, Louisiana made a surprise move.
The Louisiana Attorney General sued EPA and challenged EPA's action not only in these complaints and in this investigation, but also its Title VI regulations writ large.
Louisiana wasn't just challenging this one Title VI complaint in St. John. They were challenging the whole premise of disparate impact.
The Attorney General argued that EPA's regulations prohibiting disparate impact under Title VI were unlawful.
Louisiana was going after one of the last remaining parts of civil rights law for achieving environmental justice. And they were doing it using a time-worn tactic, accusing the people pointing out racial inequality of being racist themselves. They were essentially saying, I'm not racist, you are. According to the lawsuit, by considering the disparate impact of pollution on Black people in St. John, EPA was actually discriminating against everyone else. The Attorney General said that EPA officials were, quote, moonlighting as social justice warriors fixated on race. It was an aggressive argument and one that went against precedent entirely. Federal courts and the Supreme Court had ruled that disparate impact was something that agencies like the EPA could use. So it seemed like the EPA was on solid footing for a legal showdown. But then,
the EPA dropped its investigation into Louisiana's Cancer Alley and its link to racial discrimination, plunging environmental advocates into a state of unrest.
So unfortunately, in response to the lawsuit, EPA caved. And it closed the St. John Title VI complaints and provided no relief to the community under the Title VI process.
After all that momentum, the EPA suddenly just gave up. The decision surprised Dina, who thought they were on their way to a groundbreaking agreement.
Was that something that y'all were expecting?
No, we weren't expecting it. Negotiations were going well. We were anticipating the parties to sign the informal resolution agreement.
The majority of us wanted it to go to court.
Here's Dr. Beverly Wright from the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice.
As hard as EPA worked to get the deal, with the state, and our Democratic governor had agreed to all of it, the EPA, they had to follow what came down from the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice wimped out and decided not to pursue it.
I reached out to Michael Reagan and the EPA for comment, but they declined to speak with me. So if legal precedent was on their side, what was the Department of Justice afraid of? Well, a lot has changed at the Supreme Court.
Of course, looming over this whole case is the fact that our Supreme Court is also entertaining arguments that previous Supreme Courts have not entertained, and they're overturning precedent.
If Louisiana's lawsuit had gotten all the way to the Supreme Court, as many predicted it would, this whole part of civil rights law could be gutted, not just in Louisiana, but across the country. This would mean that any attempt to address systemic disparities rather than individual cases of racism would be nearly impossible. And maybe for the Biden administration, the risk that Louisiana might win was just too big of a risk to take. But others, like Beverly, disagree.
They were afraid that they might win and it would destroy their chances elsewhere. Well, it was destroyed anyway.
That's because dropping the complaints didn't stop Louisiana from going after Title VI.
The court ended up agreeing with Louisiana and issued a preliminary injunction prohibiting the EPA and the Department of Justice from enforcing their disparate impact regulations against Louisiana agencies under Title VI.
In 2024, a bunch more state attorneys general, all Republicans, petitioned EPA to completely eliminate disparate impact from its regulations. When I talked to Dina back then, it felt like the country was on the verge of a huge rollback.
For 60 years, Title VI has been a critical tool in stopping discrimination nationwide, not only in the environmental context, but also in transportation and education, in all sorts of areas. So these attorneys general, what they're proposing now is to go back on social equity. I think some of these states are doing whatever they can to make sure that they don't have to comply with federal civil rights law.
And sure enough, one of the first actions of the current Trump administration was to do exactly what Louisiana and these other states wanted: to revoke every disparate impact regulation it could find, all the way back to the 1960s. But let's go back to 2023, when the Biden EPA dropped the Title VI investigation in the corridor.
The closure has triggered a ripple effect across the country. EPA has watered down agreements with other states. So this decision ultimately leaves some of the most vulnerable communities even more vulnerable.
So civil rights, for now, was out the window. But weren't there a few other lawsuits using other laws that could still work? What about the new rules for emissions at chemical plants that Reagan announced on his visit?
Louisiana granted a 2-year extension for Denka, but it's unclear if that could be overturned by the EPA. Denka has recently said the EPA ruling would force it to shut its doors.
And Louisiana's Attorney General, the one who had sued to overturn the whole concept of disparate impact? His name is Jeff Landry, and he's now the governor. Here he is at a press conference at Denka.
This is the only manufacturing facility
in the United States that produces neoprene. And why is that important? Well, because neoprene is used in a lot of very, very important products, such as latex gloves. Oh boy, we used a lot of those during the pandemic. IV bags. The Department of Defense uses neoprene. I know many hunters use neoprene, so it's important to me because I'm a hunter.
As governor, Landry even signed a law making it illegal for community groups to use and share data from their own air monitoring tools. Tools like the bucket used by the Louisiana Bucket Brigade. Even the new rules about chemical emissions that Reagan announced got hung up in court and are now in the process of being rolled back by the Trump administration. So with all these legal pathways hitting a seeming dead end, where does that leave the people in the corridor? Not long after the Title VI complaint was dismissed, I asked Shamira Levine of Rise St. James what keeps her going in the face of adversity.
Faith is what sustains us. That stone that David used to take out Goliath was faith. It wasn't that it was a special stone, it was about what was going into that stone being thrown. David already saw the defeat of Goliath, and we have to keep our eye on the defeat of Goliath. It's critical to remain focused on what you visualize for your community and remember why you're doing it.
And for people worried about chloroprene pollution in St. John, at the end of a long, disheartening legal road, a few surprises were still in store.
Thursday night, in a 7-4 vote, the St. John School Board voted to close Fifth Ward Elementary for the 2025-2026 school year.
That school near Denka closed. The school board cited declining enrollment and budget concerns as the reason, not pollution. But the students closest to the plant, the ones most at risk, got relocated regardless. And then, in the spring of 2025, an even bigger surprise.
After years of environmental concerns from the neighbors, the Denka chemical plant in St. John Parish is suspending operations.
That's right. The plant at the center of all the lawsuits and the Title VI complaint closed. Not because of any legal action, and not because its parent company decided to stop polluting. Denka said the reason was financial. Decrease in global demand, declining profits, and what they claimed were the extraordinary cost required to meet environmental regulations. I reached out to Denka for this story, but never got a response. For now, big questions remain unresolved. Chloroprene isn't the only toxic chemical here, and many politicians and industry leaders still chalk up death and illness near these plants to individual lifestyle choices. The way the law stands now, the whole definition of racism is individual too. It's only discrimination if somebody says it out loud. Maybe that's because it's too overwhelming to think of these things as systemic, as collective choices. Or maybe it's because it lets a whole lot of people off the hook. Here's Shamira Levine again.
We're trying to change something that has been flawed for decades. And we're trying to change the people who are benefiting from this financially, who are willing to turn a blind eye. We still have to stay on the EPA to make sure there's consequences whenever the industries break the law, because they will break the law. They've been breaking the law historically since they've been here. They cannot be trusted. They're not good neighbors. As bad as we want it to change, it takes time. It takes a lot of time, and it's a marathon, it's an emotional ride.
Next time, in the face of setback after setback, what's next?
People just don't realize how contaminated they are. I think it's all that NIMBY mentality. I don't really see that plant right here, so it couldn't be harming me. Okay, but it is.
The Corridor is presented by Threshold and Oracle Productions. Jaha Naila Avery is our reporter and host. Writing, mixing, and production by Erica Janik and Sam Moore. Music by Joy Clark and Todd Sikafus. I'm executive producer Amy Martin. Learn more and support the show at thresholdpodcast.org.